for that wonderful introduction. I have been coming to GundxChanges for a while, and I am so honored to get to give one just as I'm transitioning out of here. So I have been a postdoc for almost 2 years here, and I wanted to say thanks to the Gund Institute. It's been a really incredible environment to connect with so many different types of people, researchers, and engaged folks. But I'm on day 5 of a new job, which is really exciting, and I get to do a lot more applied work, but also oversee some research in the region that builds on the work that I've started here at UVM. So I am now wearing a new hat of the American Farmland Trust, but still have some strong collaborations with the University of Vermont. And so just to give you a heads up, I made like 30 slides. I probably shouldn't have made quite as many. So I'm going to try to get through some of them, maybe a little quick. And if you're not familiar with payment for ecosystem services, just like hold your question in and we'll get to it at the end. I want to give you some context around what payment for ecosystem services, because I'm not sure what the knowledge of everyone coming to this group is. Hi, thanks for coming.
I'm sorry.
And then a little context for how this tool is being considered and developed in Vermont. And then I'm going to take a real deep dive into just one little aspect of the research that I've been doing on that in the state that I think is kind of exciting. I haven't really shared this with other people yet. I feel like this is a great place to do that, especially as I'm hoping to maybe like pass on some of these things to other folks at UVM. Okay, so we need to start with oh, working. There we go. I'll just use the old-fashioned one. It was working. They gave me this beautiful pointer. Let's see. All right. We're gonna skip it. Oh, so that's not working either. That's also not working. Sorry. Okay, so the first slide says, what are payment for ecosystem services? Maybe you've seen it before. It's a diagram of a flow of payments and services. Thanks, Ben. Okay. So the quick version is that payment for ecosystem services are tools to incentivize the enhancement of ecosystem services. And you have some basic principles. One, they're voluntary, so it's not a regulation. People opt in. Another principle is that the community that benefits should be the payer. And the payments should go directly to whoever is providing those ecosystem services. So in the case of most of my research, that's the farmers, right? They're doing changes on their farm that enhance ecosystem services or reduce maybe negative environmental impacts. Another principle is that those changes should be incentivized by the program. It shouldn't be something that would have happened without any kind of intervention at all. And then the last piece is that those payments are supposed to be conditional upon the provisioning of a service. You kind of need to just verify that that's happening. And there's a lot of literature about what PES are, but basically they're a conservation incentive program for farmers in the context where I'm working. And a lot of existing programs totally qualify as PES programs and they don't get that label. So like the CRP program, a lot of NRCS programs that's already paying farmers to make changes with the assumption that those practices that they're helping compensate farmers for will result in greater environmental goods. But there's a new kind of PES conversation that's going on, and Vermont is one of the places where there's a lot of activity and a lot of interest. So in 2019, the legislature passed Act 83, and that started this multi-stakeholder working group tasked with basically like advising the state of Vermont on how they could leverage new payment for ecosystem services concepts to help meet both the state's goals around environmental policy, but also support farm viability. And really the list of the things they were hoping to get out of PES in Vermont is like everything. Like, let's put all the problems on this one new tool that we don't know how to do yet perfectly. And what's unique about this is that these programs that people are exploring right now are based on measured outcomes. So rather than paying a farmer maybe like 80% of the cost of cover cropping and incentivizing them to do cover cropping and knowing that that has an environmental benefit, instead we're paying for maybe $40 per ton of carbon sequestered. And the farmer can do whatever they want, but the payment is, instead of being based on the cost of the practice, it's based on like the quantified, measured environmental outcome. So that's like the big change. I didn't look at my slides, so if you're reading the bullets, but really like this group that was created has a lot of different people from across Vermont that are working on that together. So it's got farmer groups, it's got lots of the nonprofits that have been working with farmers on conservation incentives for a long time. It has a bunch of the environmental agencies, it has state agency folks. It's kind of, they basically said everybody who should be part of this conversation and making the solution work, get together and figure it out for us. And so they identified in that act of legislation the ecosystem services that should be incentivized. That includes water quality, flood resilience, and climate stability. And they really focused on soil health as the foundation for providing those ecosystem services. So the work has really been focused on soil health. And there's been some tension about like, can we go beyond soil health? But that's really been a place that they've identified as being like a first step. We can do this. And that group is also tasked with figuring out how much to pay for some unit of soil health and how you measure soil health. And they're supposed to estimate what the benefits to the state are of a new program, figure out how to pay for administering a new program, and lots. We're not going to talk about all of that, but there's tons of research that needs to be done, and these people really need your help. So if you're interested in like one little piece and you want to engage with local stakeholders, there's a huge list of problems and things that folks from the Gund Institute and UVM could really help with. Okay, so here's the vision that multi-stakeholder working group put out, and they're really trying to like change the system. So this is from their initial report. We envision a system in which farmers are hired to use their ingenuity and know-how in caring for the land to rebuild Vermont's natural capital. At first, it was very visionary. They're 2 years in, and they're really like trying to simplify to make it work. And so there's always been this tension between like the holistic and complex vision for what PES could be and the reality of like creating something that people can actually enroll in and we can fund and we can measure and do. And so that complexity versus like actualization of implementation is a tension that has come out in a lot of different things. So you'll notice the Gund Institute has a seat on the working group. I think the first year Taylor Ricketts was the member, and over the last year I've gotten to be part of holding that seat. And then for my postdoc work over the last 2 years, I've kind of had two big projects. One was on measuring soil health across the state of Vermont, and the other was running a technical services research contract for this working group. And we created, I think, about 10 or 11 different reports, kind of doing some background homework for them. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but that exists. And I'm going to talk about one little tiny piece of it today. Okay, so maybe I'll breeze through these next two because I want to get into that. All right, so I would consider, like, to summarize the current conditions in Vermont and where this group is at in the development of these performance-based programs. Key challenges are this complexity in the relationship between soil health and water quality. So initially, people said, let's incentivize soil health and we'll get all these ecosystem services from it. And they included water quality in that. But if you're an environmental scientist, you know that there's not a correlation between soil health and water quality. And there actually are cases where, you know, enhancing pore structure and infiltration can lead to greater subsurface loss of nutrients. And that's just poorly studied and understood. And maybe not everybody in the public sphere understands that. And that's going to be a challenge to get people to get on board with understanding there's not a correlation. So that's been a huge challenge, especially because they hoped that some of the water quality funding around phosphorus mitigation in Lake Champlain would be part of paying for PES. There's still debates about how do we measure performance, whether or not we model it, do we go and measure it on every field, do we do a subsection of fields on a farm? I'm not going to talk about that, but those are some of the challenges that people are struggling with. And then of course, a lot about like, how do we balance rewarding the farmers that have already invested in providing ecosystem services? They're here. Like if this is your measure of ecosystem service provisioning, there are some amazing farmers. You know, there's an Aldo Leopold Award that was granted to Guy Chouanier last year. His organic matter levels are like 10% in his fields. Incredible, he's here. And if we're talking about like a real PES program, we're supposed to be paying for additionality. So that's like something that would be new and different. And there's a lot of farmers that are doing a great job. And they, you know, we want to support them and being viable. We don't want them to not be eligible. But we kind of have to balance whether or not we're paying for farmers that are at a low level to increase provisioning of ecosystem services, and then balance somehow like keeping the farmers that have already invested their own time and their own resources into doing that already into the program somehow. So yeah, I am not going to give you the answer to that, but the funding, the state of Vermont, doesn't have enough funding to like really do this in a big way. So they're thinking about where else can we get funding to support a payment for ecosystem services program if this group designs something that's really great and worthwhile. And maybe that has to be partnerships with private folks. I think that's a big question that not many people have gotten into. And then of course, who's going to administer the program? They have decided it's probably going to be for this first pilot, it's going to be the state of Vermont, the Agency of Agriculture. But that was a big question for a while. And I think some people still think maybe it should have been someone else. All right, but there's lots of great stuff going on in Vermont too. Okay, there are existing programs that can be used as models to learn from. There are existing measurement tools that we can think about adapting. There are some models. There's also maybe a lot of the like carbon market excitement. There's new information about how to measure some of those things. And there's research at UVM going on right now to really advance that in the room, which is exciting. And then one thing that's also really great is like, this is a place where the environmental groups and the farmers are like both in it together. And I think often around environmental policy and agriculture, they're not on the same side. But this is one place where like everybody's on board. Like, who's not on the soil health train? The farmers are on it, they're super excited. Like all of the environmental groups are there too. So that's a really exciting, positive place to start from. And then, for the farmers, they've been asking for this for a long time. And one of the things that they've been really interested in, they actually wrote a proposal before that legislation was passed, asking for Vermont to figure this out. They wanted to do like a lot of monitoring, right? And to do that measurement. And the data could maybe be a basis for payment, but they're also really interested in learning about agro-ecosystem function. And so these performance-based programs offer this other benefit in the form of like information and, complex agro-ecosystems are very knowledge intensive to run. And so this is a tool that kind of fits into supporting that feedback of information and adaptive management. From the state side and the regulatory side, it's a really cost-effective way to meet environmental goals. They don't have to estimate how many tons of carbon were sequestered or how many pounds of phosphorus were reduced, because that's already the basis for the payment of the program, right? So the risk gets put a little bit more on the farmer to make changes that will do that. But so that's one of the other things that's kind of drawing it forward. And then there are some funding options that exist. And I think I already talked about these a little bit, but there are some very specific Vermont environmental goals that the PES programs could help the state meet. And these are the two pilot programs that have kind of been started. The Pay for Phosphorus program enrolled farmers last winter, and that's based on paying farmers per pound of phosphorus reduced above a threshold. And they're really interested in continuing research relationships. Taylor is involved in that. And if anyone's interested in that program, I think there's opportunities for other research. And then this working group that I mentioned, they have $500,000 to fund a pilot based around soil health. So those are kind of like two little pieces that are started along this path. Okay. I was just going to plug that we've started to look at measurement is important because there's lots of evidence that practices don't always do what you think they're going to do. A number of colleagues from UVM and I published a paper that has some of that evidence in Vermont, but I'm not going to talk about it today. And then here's another paper we published last year that gets really deep into like how farmers in Vermont are thinking about stewardship and what their concerns about payment for ecosystem services are. And so that's my summary of like all the big picture stuff that I'm not going to talk about. And with the second half of my 30 minutes, I really want to focus on the idea of payment because it's kind of a problem. Right, so one of the biggest, who has like thought about payment for ecosystem services a little bit already? Okay, so some of us, one of the biggest concerns that people have that like worries them about payment for ecosystem services is that there is plenty of evidence that when these compensation programs show up or these payment programs show up, people get used to being paid for that ecosystem service provisioning. And when the funding dries up for the program and the payment's not there anymore, they think they should be getting paid to do the conservation, and they stop doing it because they're not getting paid anymore. But before the program was there, people have these kind of intrinsic sense of care and responsibility to the environment. And so there's evidence that these kinds of market-based valuations that come with PES erode those stewardship motivations. And that's like the heartbreaking, scary thing about PES, I think. And it's like one little piece of the picture, but I want to just focus on it today because I think it's really important. And I have some interesting information that I haven't really shared with people. So I want to do that today. Okay, and so here's just some background research on this specific topic. So it's often called motivational crowding out. And I think eroding stewardship motivations works too, but crowding out is kind of the term that people use. So those existing conservation motivations get crowded out by the new value of money. But there's some other really interesting cases where, especially here's one in Costa Rica that Molly Chapman, who I think was at UBC, she did interviews with farmers in Costa Rica. And even though the program was being framed as payment, they talked about it as compensation for stewardship. And they imposed their own values and their own framing onto the way they talked about the program. So even though the program was like very framed as very like monetary or capitalist, their motivations and their stewardship ethic and their sense of care was just like really robust, right? And it just basically didn't let the crowding out happen. And then, you know, I think there's a lot of literature that gets into how designing payment for ecosystem services as rural development rather than payment, and framing it as compensation, like the terminology counts. When you use a different word, it really changes how people react. Can address those issues of motivational crowding out. So there's like examples of, instead of paying somebody, maybe you give them a credit towards a development, or I think, you know, I've talked to Ernesto Mendez quite a bit about this, and he was talking about examples in Central America where instead of it being kind of an individual payment to a farmer, it might be like a company or a buyer would invest in like a community center or something that benefits the whole community. And so it's a change in the framing and the wording, and that can really influence this crowding out phenomenon. And there's, I really like this. So empowering the local actors with resources and autonomy, and reinforcing those kind of the values that they have that they relate to the environment, supports their commitment and their capacity to provide ecosystem services. So we really think about it, instead of like paying them for a ton of phosphorus, it's like we are investing in their capacity to provide ecosystem services, and we think about all of what they need. It's a very different framing. There's a paper I read the other day about how there's this project in Bolivia called the Water Shared Project, and they gave in-kind compensation rather than payments, and increased the whatever tool they were using to measure motivations, kind of increase some of those stewardship motivations and sense of care to the environment. So the scary part of motivational crowding out, it's actually like happens in very different ways, and it's very context dependent, right? So when I approach the work in Vermont, one of my questions is like, how much risk is there of crowding out in Vermont? I worked with farmers for 10 years before I came to UVM, and I don't want the community that I know and love that cares about the environment to change, and so I've been worried about that. So is there a risk? And then like, what maybe could we think about as alternative forms of compensation that could be part of a bigger package rather than just payment, like monetary payments to farmers? So I'm going to take the next part of this. Actually, I think the timing is off, so I don't know where I am on timing, but to tell you about some of the research that we've done that gets at this. 10? Okay, great. I'm on slide 11:30. So we have done this kind of 3-phase mixed methods approach to talking with farmers about compensation and getting some input from them. So at first we did a focus group with farmers in January, and we just kind of like, this was just to think about, get their idea how they're talking about it, what word they're using, what ideas they had. And then we did a survey. So we have basically like small qualitative exploratory piece of the research. Then we have quantitative data. And then we did 35 interviews where we got some more like rich content around this. Okay, so this phase one, we called it a PES farmer think tank. We invited farmers that have been showing up to the working group meetings, that cared, that like really were already familiar with this new tool of PES. And we talked with them about very broad questions about program design, alternative forms of compensation, and we got their input on developing the survey. So we came up with this list of like alternative forms of compensation, and we framed it around like maybe Vermont's government doesn't have enough money to like fully fund the big vision of PES. What are other ways we can compensate farmers in Vermont? And so we looked at like tax incentive programs, government contributions to retirement funds. If you have friends that are farmers, they usually don't have retirement. They count on their land for that. Workman's comp premiums. There's some very specific kind of things that farmers need and probably would appreciate as compensation. And so this is a fun list. There's health insurance on here, different rankings for loan programs, maybe like crop insurance premiums would change, even maybe reduced fines for regulatory violations if they're showing that they have committed to provisioning of ecosystem services. Okay, sorry, I'm going a little fast, but then the survey, we asked a lot of questions about their farm, about ecosystem services, about their motivations, their capacity, their perceived capacity, their belief, where they get information. And I think there's an opportunity to do a lot more with this data set than I have already. But I think to summarize for the context of what the conversation is today, we found that farmers want to have a very high level of stewardship ethic. 90% of farmers in Vermont, or those that responded to our survey, were willing to take a survey, believe they have a responsibility to be part of climate solutions. It's huge, right? Like they have that. 82% believe that we're in a state of climate emergency due to human-caused climate change. And 94% of them already believe that they have the knowledge and skill to enhance soil health in their farm. So maybe training and knowledge isn't like the weak point, but only 58% have the financial capacity to do so. So it points to kind of the financial constraints being really important. Other parts of the survey, we asked farmers like multiple choice question about all those different alternative compensation ideas that we were so excited about. And they all picked money. We were like, you can get healthcare, you can get retirement, you can get all this stuff you're asking for. And everyone was like, we need money. 92% of them ranked the direct monetary payment as preferred. Tax incentives were also up there as well. And then all the others were about 20 or 30%. And the other two papers I mentioned have like documentation that farmers in Vermont, like financial constraints are the primary factor that's limiting their adoption of conservation practices and enhancing ecosystem services. We knew that already, but we thought maybe they would think about other things. So I was really hoping we'd have something more interesting from that, right? Like maybe it's healthcare. Now there's only so much you can get out of a survey, right? So we did these 34 farmer interviews to follow up, and we talked about a lot about compensation. We talked a lot about like how much they should be paid. So it's kind of a we're willingness to accept study, but we added some other questions about compensation as well. And I'm only going to talk about one of the interesting pieces. So we did the grounded theory approach to analyzing that data with two wonderful people who aren't here. So this is teamwork. Ellen Frederick, who's a master's student in the food systems program, and then Noor El-Nabusi, who was a research assistant for us last winter. And then I did this comparative analysis with some asset-based frameworks to kind of put this into a picture that I thought helped make sense. Okay. How many minutes do I have now?
Just over 5.
Okay. So this isn't all of what they talked about, but this is what I want to share with you today. So when they talked about how much they needed to be paid, it was always in relation to like how complex the program was. Like if we need to do a lot of reporting and a lot of paperwork, then we need to be paid more. If we have to make a lot of changes and they're high cost, we need to be paid more. But if it's super simple, like say I just check yes on a box and you use a satellite imagery and you know that I'm doing cover cropping for 2 extra weeks and that gets me a payment, and like it could be $15 an acre, and so the idea of like how much farmers need to be paid, it depends. But it's we have some really interesting quotes from them about that. And then there are different kinds of burden. So we kind of categorize these different, there's the administrative burden, that's part of that, like what the compensation should be covering. That's like how much paperwork they have to do essentially, and data reporting. And then they also think about that and like the cost of the management changes. And then there's like this third piece, which is trust. So the compensation might need to be a little bit more if the person that you're sharing your data with or enrolling with is like maybe an environmental regulator that you don't trust. But if it's a really friendly agency like VHCB, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, maybe you wouldn't need like a little bit more to be willing to trust. But if you got paid enough, you would enroll with people that maybe you don't trust. That's a simple summary. And then I think the really like rich part of the data set is about all the different kinds of compensation that they talked about, both when they were prompted to talk about it, but also that they came up across the data set. So of course, like monetary offsets are like hugely important, but there are all these other pieces that are part of the puzzle. So they talked a lot about learning from other farmers and technical assistance and equipment, access to equipment. They talked about like the increase in soil health being of value to them. And a lot of people talked about like they would do things anyways, they didn't need to be paid. So there's really strong already kind of potential for reinforcement of existing stewardship ethic. And then farmers are always jazzed about data. They're excited about that. Okay, and so what I did is I kind of coded these different types of compensation. And then I looked at how they fit into asset-based lenses. Is anyone familiar with the sustainable livelihoods approach or the community capitals framework? So this is often used to think about like adaptive capacity or resilience, but here I'm using those kind of a combination of the sustainable livelihoods approach and the community capitals framework. And instead of it being kind of adaptive capacity, I'm looking at like how do all of these different resources that a farmer can draw on influence their capacity to steward ecosystem services. So it's not just the natural capital of their farm and the financial assets that they have, but you can invest in other asset bases or resources that support farmers' capacity to enhance ecosystem services. And I think I might run out of time, but I think the big picture is that like it's not just money, like they need all of the things in order to do this and to do this over time. And so this is kind of a fun little picture into that. So I've got some farmer quotes because I think it's really important to kind of share their voices. So I'll just read one example of like this intrinsic stewardship motivation, which I would put under a cultural capital. I never got any payment for that. I just do it because I think it's the right thing to do. All right, here's somebody suggesting healthcare. Great idea. You guarantee that you do your best to improve soil health and your family gets healthcare. That'd be awesome, right? So even though maybe they didn't fill it out in the survey, like that's a good idea if you're taking care of the financial piece. People also talked about getting access to technical equipment and technical expertise. So here's one farmer said, provide me technical equipment and access to technical expertise to increase my crop yields through soil health. That's what matters. Let's tie it into what I'm going to do. And people also often just said it so directly, like technical assistance, it's motivating. Right, that's what you're looking for. Okay, so there are other things besides payment that we should be thinking about to support farmers in stewarding ecosystem services. There's a lot of quotes about soil data and agroecosystem knowledge. So here's one. It's invaluable to have that information and that data tracking across time to see if our practice is actually working. Sometimes our assumptions about a practice might just be wrong, or those things are really complicated at least. I think it's valuable too. So people are really interested in the way that they can learn about the like context specific of their site. 2 minutes. Okay. Oh, here's the fun thing. If you haven't played with the asset-based frameworks. What's really nice about it is sometimes like people will talk about how one resource base influences another one. And sometimes it can be like a spiral. So here's an example of a farmer talking about how having the ability to measure or getting that kind of knowledge about their agroecosystem aids them in enhancing their natural capital, right? So that's like a really simple one. But then we might also get, okay, so here's somebody who took part in the soil health cohort. So that's like a peer learning environment. That's social capital that's being invested in by the intervention. And that enhanced their knowledge, which in turn enhances their natural capital. So there's a lot of really cool connections to be made in thinking about it in this asset-based framework. Okay, and then I think to summarize, right, these non-monetary forms of compensation that I'm so excited about hearing your thoughts on, I think they're important because they really address the contextual needs of farmers and they can crowd in or reinforce stewardship motivations. So I'm really hopeful that the Vermont programs will kind of take this bigger view around what compensation means beyond payment. And I think about it as like these other pieces of compensation enhance the capacity of the farm to make changes that enhance ecosystem services. It also enhances the farm's capacity to address other challenges like, transforming in the face of some kind of shock or threat, adapting to new things, maybe just like surviving and being there to be a steward of the land in the future. And I think about stewardship as like care in action. So stewardship isn't just like the way that you think about the land, but you can, stewardship is both like the way that you relate to the land, but also how you do that. And you need dimensions of both like this care, deep care about the land and the earth. And you also need to be able to do something, right? So you need that capability. And then the third piece is like agency, right? So you need the care, the practice, and then you need like the capacity, right? And the ability to do that. And when I think about this suite or package of compensation, it's addressing all of those things. So it's kind of looking at stewardship, not just as countable tons of carbon or phosphorus, but really as stewardship as a whole picture. So yeah, I think that is all. And I know that I maybe went fast through some things, but this last piece, like the categorization of the non-monetary forms of compensation is something that we haven't published, but I'm working on a manuscript and I'm really interested in like what resonates about it with you. And if you don't want to talk about that part and you just want to talk about PES, we can too, but I'm really curious about what this community thinks of this, using the asset-based framework around the compensation. So with that, I'll say I'm still around. I'm just wearing a new hat, working for the American Farmland Trust. My UVM email still works for a while, but I do have a new email address. And I so appreciate the opportunity to share the new research that I'm working on. I think that it's an exciting new kind of like research piece to think about compensation in PES, but then also it has a lot of applicability. So the Human Ecosystem Services Working Group is really interested in this, and hopefully it can influence their decision-making